Have you ever stopped to wonder what lies beneath the streets you walk on every day? We move about our cities, rarely glancing down, and never truly seeing the intricate world below. But beneath our feet is another universe, a vast network of tunnels, pipes, and chambers stretching for miles, hidden from sight. This underworld is more than just concrete and steel. It's the very foundation that keeps our cities alive. And while most people remain blissfully unaware, a few brave souls descend into this hidden world every day to keep it functioning, ensuring that life above can continue undisturbed. My name is John, and I am one of those people. I am a StormDrain worker, part of a dwindling group of individuals tasked with maintaining the arteries of the city. Our work is unseen, often overlooked, and yet, without it, chaos would unfold above ground. The heavy rains that roll in, season after season, the surging waters that threaten to rise above, and even the very structure of the streets and buildings, these are all, in part, kept in check by us. We are the guardians of a world few ever see and fewer still understand. For as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around these tunnels and drains. My father was a StormDrain worker, as was his father before him. In our family, this job is more than just a means of making a living. It's a calling, a responsibility passed down through the generations. I grew up hearing stories about the labyrinthine systems below the city, stories that fascinated and terrified me as a child. While other kids were dreaming of becoming astronauts or doctors, I was learning about pressure gauges, water levels, and the subtle art of reading gas meters. My earliest memories are filled with images of my father in his work gear, ready to disappear into the depths of the city. He would come home after long days, his clothes soaked and his hands stained with the grit and grime of his work. I remember the look in his eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and a quiet pride. He never spoke much about his days in the drains, but every now and then he would share a story or two. There was a reverence in his voice when he spoke of the tunnels, as if they were sacred places that demanded both caution and respect. In my family, we spoke of the tunnels almost like they were a living thing, a silent, breathing entity that connected every corner of the city. The tunnels had moods, my father would say, and if you were sensitive enough, you could feel them. There were days when the drains were calm, their echoing chambers filled with nothing more than the soft trickle of water and the distant hum of the city above. But there were other days, he would warn, when the tunnels felt alive, as if they were watching you, listening to every step you took. When I was old enough, my father took me down into the tunnels for the first time. I remember feeling a mixture of excitement and fear as I followed him down the narrow path to the northeastern entrance. The air was thick, humid, and filled with an earthy smell that clung to everything. The sound of our footsteps echoed against the walls, creating an eerie rhythm that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. My father moved with ease, his steps sure and steady, while I stumbled behind, trying to keep up. As we ventured deeper, the light from the entrance faded, and the world above disappeared. I was completely immersed in the dark, silent world below, a place that felt ancient and timeless. My father taught me the importance of respect and caution. The tunnels don't care about you, he would say. They'll swallow you up if you're not careful. Over the years, I learned to listen to the subtle sounds, the creaks and groans of the pipes, the soft drip of water, the rush of air through a narrow passage. Each sound was a clue, a whisper from the tunnels that told you what to expect, what dangers lay ahead. I learned to trust my instincts, to move with purpose and caution. In the tunnels, there was no room for hesitation. A single misstep could mean the difference between life and death. I spent years working alongside my father, learning everything he knew. He taught me how to read water levels, how to check for gas leaks, and how to navigate the complex network of tunnels without getting lost. But more than that, he taught me the unspoken rules of the job. Mark your path, he would say, handing me a piece of chalk. Never assume you'll remember the way. Even though he knew the tunnels like the back of his hand, he never failed to mark his route. It was a habit drilled into him by his father, and now it was being drilled into me. As the years passed, I grew more comfortable in the tunnels. I began to understand the strange connection my father felt to this underground world. There was a certain peace in the solitude of the drains, a quietness that was hard to find anywhere else. Above ground, the city was always buzzing with life, filled with noise and activity. But down below, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the soft sounds of water and the faint vibrations of the city above. When my father retired, he passed his tools down to me, just as his father had done before him. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound, as if he were passing down a legacy. With those tools came a sense of responsibility, a duty to protect the city from the unseen dangers below. I felt a deep connection to the tunnels, a bond that was hard to explain. I knew every twist and turn, every hidden corner, every small imperfection in the walls. The tunnels were like a second home to me, a place where I felt both vulnerable and powerful. But over the years, the tunnels changed. The city grew, and with it, the drains expanded. New tunnels were added, old ones were abandoned, and the network became even more complex. I began to notice strange things, a shift in the air, an unfamiliar smell, a sudden increase in water levels that couldn't be explained by the weather. I chalked it up to the natural evolution of the city, a consequence of growth and progress. Still, there were days when the tunnels felt different, as if they were hiding something. The familiar passages seemed darker, the sounds more ominous. I dismissed it as my imagination, a trick of the mind that came from spending too much time in the dark. But the feeling persisted, a nagging sense of unease that I couldn't shake. There were rumors, of course. Every StormDrain worker had heard them. Stories of strange sightings, unexplained sounds, tunnels that seemed to appear and disappear. Most of us laughed them off, attributing them to the overactive imaginations of rookies or the ramblings of old-timers. But deep down, I knew there was some truth to the stories. I'd seen things, heard things, things I couldn't explain. The tunnels were vast, stretching far beyond the boundaries of the city, and there were parts of the network that hadn't been explored in years. One night after a heavy storm, I got a call from the city council. There had been flooding in the industrial area, and they needed me to check it out. It was a routine call, the kind I'd received countless times before. But as I gathered my gear and prepared to head down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this time would be different. The call came in the early morning while the rain was still falling in sheets against my window. The city council didn't usually call me at this hour unless there was something serious. I glanced at the clock as I answered, already bracing myself for whatever emergency lay ahead. As soon as I picked up, I could hear the tension in the council representative's voice. "John, we've got flooding. Bad flooding. It's in the industrial area, and we need you down there now." There was a sense of urgency in her tone that struck me as odd. Flooding in the industrial section wasn't unheard of, but usually it was dealt with methodically and calmly. This time, however, there was a note of panic, a desperation I hadn't heard before. As she explained further, I gathered that the water levels had risen unusually fast, filling streets and flowing into buildings in a way that suggested something more than just heavy rain was at play. A blockage? A structural failure? These thoughts churned through my mind as I assured her I'd be there right away. Pulling on my raincoat and grabbing my gear, I mentally ran through my checklist. It had been a while since I'd had to deal with a flood this intense. I threw my boots and gloves in the truck and set out toward the industrial sector, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The city was shrouded in a heavy mist and the streets were eerily empty. In the dim light of dawn, the rain-slicked roads gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the streetlights in blurred patches of yellow. The closer I got to the industrial district, the worse the roads became. Puddles had grown into shallow lakes, and I could see debris, small branches, stray pieces of trash, floating in the rushing water that spilled over the curbs. It was worse than I'd expected. When I finally parked and got out, the water was high enough to soak my boots as I stepped onto the flooded street. The wind was picking up, carrying the faint smell of smoke and something else, an acrid, metallic scent I couldn't quite place. I checked my equipment and secured my gloves, noting the worn spots on my gear, reminders of the years I'd spent down in the tunnels. Pulling my flashlight from my belt, I made my way toward the northeast entrance to the storm drains. This was the main access point for this section of the drainage network, a place I knew all too well. The entrance gaped open, a dark void in the earth framed by dripping moss and the jagged edges of worn concrete. As I stepped closer, the first thing that caught my attention was the water level. It was far higher than I'd anticipated, reaching nearly to the top of the entrance. I hadn't seen it this high in years. I could feel the weight of the water pressing against the walls of the tunnel, like it was barely holding back the flood. Carefully, I took my first step into the murky water, feeling it seep through the seams of my boots. The darkness enveloped me as I moved deeper, the light from the overcast sky fading behind me. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom and illuminating the slick walls of the tunnel. Just a few feet in, I spotted something unusual, a small fire pit, still smoldering slightly. The ashes were fresh, a thin spiral of smoke curling upward. I froze, my mind racing. The idea of someone lighting a fire here in a storm drain was more than strange. It was dangerous. Fires in the drains were not only forbidden, but reckless, especially with the gas levels that sometimes accumulated down here. I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. A fire pit in the tunnel was a sign that someone had been using this space as a shelter, which wasn't uncommon, but the industrial district was notorious for housing rougher groups. Encounters in the drains weren't unheard of, and they were rarely pleasant. The people who took refuge down here tended to be desperate, sometimes hostile, and often armed with whatever they could carry. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and scanned the area, listening for any sign of movement. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint drip of water echoing down the tunnel. The usual sounds of the city above, the hum of traffic, the distant murmur of voices, were muffled, swallowed by the thick walls of the storm drain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in the shadows, eyes were following my every move. The further I waded into the tunnel, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The walls felt closer than usual, the ceiling lower, pressing down on me like the weight of the city above. My boots sloshed through the water, each step echoing hollowly in the cramped space. I took out my flood gauge, holding it against the tunnel wall. The readings confirmed my suspicions. Water levels were dangerously high, well above the normal threshold. I jotted the numbers down in my notebook, comparing them to my last set of readings for this area. Something was wrong. Water levels didn't spike this drastically without a reason, and I hadn't seen rainfall like this in years. I moved deeper, flashlight sweeping over the graffiti-covered walls, tracing the words and symbols scrawled in hasty, jagged lines. The familiar, damp, earthy smell was stronger here, mixed with the stale scent of decay. The walls were streaked with moss, and patches of mold clung to the concrete in dark, spreading blotches. I could feel the air thickening, growing heavier as I went further in. It wasn't just the damp. It was something else, a sense of age, of something ancient lurking just beyond the reach of my light. A low rumble echoed through the tunnel, faint but distinct. It was coming from above, the sound of machinery in the industrial district perhaps, but down here it sounded different, muffled and distant, as if the sound itself had to wade through the water to reach me. The vibrations reverberated through the walls, a reminder of the city that loomed above, oblivious to the silent world beneath its feet. I made a mental note of every detail as I moved along, marking my route with a piece of chalk, an old habit my father had drilled into me. Even though I knew these tunnels better than the back of my hand, I wasn't taking any chances. The deeper I ventured, the more the sound of the city faded, replaced by an eerie silence that clung to me like a second skin. As I rounded a bend, my flashlight caught a flicker of movement. I froze, squinting into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I saw it again, a faint shadow slipping along the edge of my light. I stepped closer, heart pounding, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing there, only the empty tunnel stretching ahead. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. It was easy to let your mind play tricks on you down here, in the damp, suffocating dark. But the silence wasn't just in my mind. The usual sounds of the water rushing through the tunnels, like the distant hum of city life, had faded, replaced by an oppressive quiet that felt unnatural. I could hear my own breathing, the soft rasp of air echoing against the walls. My footsteps sounded too loud, each one a sharp, hollow thud in the empty space. It was as if the tunnel itself were listening, holding its breath. The air grew colder as I continued, a damp chill that seeped through my coat and settled into my bones. My flashlight flickered, casting uneven shadows that danced along the walls, twisting into strange shapes that seemed to follow me. I could feel the weight of the city pressing down, the immense mass of concrete and steel above, held up only by the thin walls of this hidden world. Every now and then, I would catch the faintest trace of a smell, something metallic, sharp, and biting, like rust or blood. It mingled with the dampness, an acrid undertone that set my teeth on edge. I knew the smells of the drains well enough to tell when something was off, and this was definitely not normal. I glanced at my gas detector, but it showed nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I moved deeper, the walls began to change. The smooth concrete gave way to rougher, crumbling stone, as if I had passed through an invisible boundary. The air grew thick, the smell of decay more pungent, clinging to my clothes, settling into the fabric. I felt a growing sense of unease, a pressure that built with each step, as if the tunnel itself were alive, pulsing with a hidden energy. I glanced down at my notes, my fingers brushing over the smudged pages of my notebook. The numbers were higher than anything I'd seen before, water levels that defied explanation. The council had been right to worry. This was no ordinary flood. The deeper I moved into the tunnel, the more the familiar gave way to the strange, and a creeping sense of unease took root. The urgency of the council's call still rang in my ears, but now I felt something else, a weight pressing down on me that was more than just responsibility. I had been down here countless times, but tonight was different. The silence felt thick, as if the walls themselves were absorbing sound, swallowing every noise except for the faint, echoing drip of water. As I moved further in, the dim light from the outside world faded, replaced by the narrow beam of my flashlight. Shadows pooled around me, gathering in the crevices and folds of the tunnel walls, stretching in ways that made the space feel smaller, more confined. The air grew heavier, thick with dampness and the faint, metallic tang of rust. It clung to me, a mix of mildew and something sour that scratched at my throat with every breath. The smoldering fire pit I'd found near the entrance was still on my mind, an uncomfortable reminder that I wasn't alone down here. The faint smoke from the fire hadn't completely dispersed, lingering in thin wisps that wound through the air like ghostly tendrils. Whoever had lit it might still be nearby, watching from the shadows. I scanned the area carefully, my flashlight cutting through the dark, the beam flickering across wet patches on the walls where moss had started to creep into the cracks. I could feel the cold water seeping into my boots, soaking through my socks, chilling my feet as I waded deeper. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, the wet, gritty texture of the tunnel wall brushing against my gloves as I moved. The further I went, the narrower the tunnel became, pressing in around me with a palpable weight. The walls glistened with a slimy film, a mix of condensation and grime that left streaks of dark green moss in patches along the stone. The smell grew worse as I descended. It was more than just the familiar, earthy scent of the drains. It was tinged with something foul, something decayed. I couldn't place it, but it seemed wrong, unnatural. It was the kind of smell that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, instinct warning me to turn back even as my mind pushed me forward. I was here to investigate the flood, to find the cause and report back. But the further I went, the more I felt like I was moving into unknown territory, a place where I didn't belong. The tunnel walls began to change, the smooth concrete giving way to rougher stone, marked by cracks and jagged edges that caught on my gloves as I brushed past. The graffiti I had seen earlier was now fading, replaced by strange symbols, crude shapes carved into the stone. They looked old, as if they had been there for years, covered in a thin layer of grime and mold that hinted at their age. I paused, shining my flashlight on one of the symbols, tracing its uneven lines with my eyes. It was unfamiliar, a twisting shape that seemed to spiral in on itself, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. A low rumble echoed through the tunnel, faint but distinct. I froze, my heart pounding as I listened, straining to catch any hint of movement. The sound was distant, a dull, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from somewhere deeper within the tunnel. I couldn't tell if it was machinery from above or something else entirely, but it set my nerves on edge. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate in time with the sound, a subtle tremor that sent ripples through the shallow water around me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and pressed on. The tunnel continued to narrow, the walls closing in until I could feel the rough stone brushing against my shoulders. I had to hunch slightly to avoid scraping my head on the low ceiling, the close quarters amplifying every sound, every drip of water and shift of my boots echoing in the confined space. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as I moved deeper. I tapped it, the light steadying for a moment before dimming again, casting uneven shadows along the walls. The shadows twisted and shifted, stretching across the stone in strange, elongated shapes that seemed to move on their own, as if they were alive. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, for Bess, a result of the dark and the damp and the silence that pressed in around me. As I rounded a bend, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber, the ceiling arching slightly above me. The water here was deeper, reaching up to my knees, cold and murky as it swirled around my legs. In the center of the chamber was a pile of debris, broken bricks, chunks of concrete, and twisted metal, half submerged in the water. It looked like part of the tunnel wall had collapsed, the rubble forming a crude dam that blocked the flow of water, causing it to pool and rise. I approached the pile cautiously, my flashlight sweeping over the debris. Something glinted in the water, catching the light, and I leaned closer, reaching out to see what it was. My fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, cold and unyielding beneath the murky surface. I pulled it free, lifting it into the light, and felt a chill run down my spine. It was a small, rusted tool, the kind used for digging an old, weathered pickaxe, its handle splintered and worn. The sight of it sent a shiver through me, a sudden, inexplicable feeling of dread that prickled at the edges of my mind. This tool didn't belong here. It was too old, too out of place, as if it had been left behind by someone or something that didn't belong in this century. I set the pickaxe down, wiping my hand on my coat as I stood, scanning the chamber for any sign of movement. The silence was absolute, the air thick with a sense of stillness that felt unnatural, oppressive. I took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling my lungs, and turned to continue down the tunnel. The further I went, the darker it became. My flashlight was barely cutting through the gloom now, its beam swallowed by the thick, suffocating blackness that surrounded me. The walls seemed to close in tighter, pressing against my shoulders, and the ceiling dipped lower, forcing me to crouch as I moved. The tunnel twisted and turned, winding deeper into the earth, each step taking me further from the world above. The smell grew stronger, a sickly, sour scent that clung to the air, seeping into my skin and clothes. It was the smell of decay, of something rotten festering in the dark, and it seemed to grow with every step I took. My stomach churned, the stench filling my nostrils, thick and cloying, a foul odor that settled in the back of my throat. I tried to push it from my mind, focusing on the task at hand, but the unease gnawed at me, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The tunnel felt alive, the walls pulsing with a silent energy that vibrated through the stone, a low hum that I could feel more than hear. It was as if the earth itself was watching, waiting, holding its breath as I ventured deeper into its hidden heart. Another rumble echoed through the tunnel, louder this time, closer, the sound vibrating through the walls and floor. I froze, heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I strained to listen. The sound was rhythmic, a steady thump, thump, thump that seemed to grow louder, more insistent, each beat reverberating through the stone. It was coming from somewhere ahead, from the darkness that stretched out before me, a black void that swallowed the light of my flashlight. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to get out, but something held me in place. Curiosity, fear, a sense of duty. I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to see what was causing the sound, to understand what was hiding in the dark. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and moved forward, each step taking me closer to the source of the noise. The air grew colder, the smell of decay thickening, wrapping around me like a shroud. My flashlight flickered again. the beam sputtering as I held it out before me, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The shadows loomed closer, darker, pressing in from all sides, and I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands slick with sweat beneath my gloves. The tunnel took a sharp turn, and as I rounded the corner, the sound hit me full force, a deafening roar that reverberated through the stone, shaking the walls and floor. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall as the noise grew louder, a relentless, pounding rhythm that filled the air, vibrating through my bones. The light flickered, casting brief, jagged shadows that danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed to move, to shift, to watch. I took a step back, heart hammering, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I searched the darkness for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. A shadow in the darkness, a massive, hulking shape that loomed at the edge of my light, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was there, a dark, shifting form that seemed to blend with the shadows, its outline barely discernible, a black void against the blackness of the tunnel. The pounding grew louder, faster, a frenzied rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart, each thud reverberating through the stone, the air, my body. I could feel it closing in, the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating, overwhelming. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the uneven floor, sending me sprawling into the shallow water. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground, its beam flickering as it spun, casting brief flashes of light across the tunnel. In those brief flashes, I saw it, huge, towering, a creature of shadow and stone, its eyes glinting in the darkness, watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps as I grabbed the flashlight, holding it out before me like a shield. The light flickered, casting a brief, wavering glow that barely penetrated the darkness. And then, with a final deafening roar, the creature surged forward, a massive, shadowy form that filled the tunnel, a nightmare-given shape, a horror from the depths. I turned and ran, the flashlight swinging wildly in my hand, the light casting fleeting shadows along the walls as I stumbled through the dark. The pounding followed me, a relentless, deafening rhythm that filled the air, vibrating through the stone, closing in with every step. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls pressing in around me, the darkness thickening, the air growing colder, heavier, suffocating. I could feel it behind me, the creature, the shadow, its presence filling the tunnel, a silent, relentless predator. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The pounding grew louder, closer, a frenzied beat that matched the pounding of my heart, each step taking me further into the darkness, into the unknown. And as I ran, as the shadows closed in around me, as the pounding filled the air, I knew that I was no longer in control, that I was lost, trapped, descending into a darkness from which there might be no escape. The tunnel around me had transformed, shifting from the damp, familiar concrete corridors of the storm drains into something foreign, archaic. This wasn't part of the drainage system. I was sure of it. The walls here weren't concrete, but compressed earth, reinforced in places with crumbling bricks that looked handmade, misshapen, and rough. As I continued, I noticed beams of old, splintering wood wedged into the walls at odd angles, remnants of what might have once been crude supports. But they didn't give the tunnel any sense of stability. Instead, they added to its age, making it feel ancient, like I was stepping back in time with every stride. The silence was overwhelming. Unlike the typical hum of the drain tunnels, there was no noise here. No echoes, no distant traffic rumbles, only the soft scuff of my own footsteps. I became painfully aware of each sound I made, the quiet scrape of my boots on loose dirt, the shallow breaths catching in my throat. The air was still, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down from all sides, the thick walls trapping me within. The tunnel was narrow, forcing me to walk sideways in parts, with walls brushing against my shoulders. It was as if this passage had been carved for something, or someone, much smaller, or at least different from any human form I could imagine. As I progressed, I started noticing odd marks along the tunnel walls. They were long, ragged scratches, like claw marks etched deep into the compacted earth. I ran my fingers over one of them, feeling the grooves left by something sharp and forceful, something that had moved with a kind of primal strength. Every so often, I would spot remnants of what looked like broken tools, handles with splintered wood, iron heads rusted and decaying. Some tools looked like primitive pickaxes or crude shovels, tools that could easily date back decades, if not longer. My flashlight cast shadows that stretched along the walls, and those shadows seemed to pulse, flickering like they were alive, shifting with a silent breath I couldn't hear but felt pressing against me. The deeper I moved into the tunnel, the more the dimensions began to change. It wasn't a uniform shape. At times, it would widen into unexpected chambers, while in other spots, the ceiling dipped so low I had to crouch to avoid scraping my head. It felt like the tunnel was a living thing, morphing to fit its surroundings or its inhabitants, and the spaces between the walls were either too tight or too open, as if they had been hastily carved out without any real plan or intention. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing in a place where I didn't belong. A space meant for something other than me. And then I heard it. At first, it was a faint sound, barely perceptible, like a distant heartbeat echoing through the tunnel. Thump. 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 I stopped, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The sound was rhythmic, steady, almost like the ticking of a clock, but slower, heavier. Each thump reverberated through the walls, sending subtle vibrations up my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just a machine from above, some distant industrial noise filtering down through layers of earth. But the regularity of it felt wrong, almost biological, like the slow, powerful beat of something alive. The sound grew louder, and I could feel each thud resonating in the ground beneath my feet, sending small ripples through the loose dirt around me. I took a few tentative steps forward, holding my breath as the thumping intensified. I could feel the rhythm in my chest now, a pulsing beat that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat, quickening as the noise drew nearer. I found myself holding my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white as I scanned the darkness, my light barely piercing the thick, suffocating shadows. As I pressed on, the thumping became more erratic, as though whatever was making the noise had picked up speed. Each beat echoed louder, faster, and I began to realize it was no longer just a sound. The walls were vibrating, like the floor beneath me shifting ever so slightly with each impact, sending tremors up my legs. I glanced back, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the noise, to make sense of it. But no explanation seemed to fit. The sound was too deep, too primal, and it was coming closer. I turned to continue forward, my every step now tinged with hesitation, my body tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel a faint draft, as if something massive were displacing the air, pushing it towards me in heavy gusts. My breaths came quick and shallow, each one filling my lungs with the thick, stale air of the tunnel. The sense of dread that had been building in the back of my mind surged forward, flooding my thoughts with images of things I couldn't explain. And then it hit me, the realization that whatever was making that noise was not just passing through these tunnels. It was pursuing me. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I broke into a run, my footsteps pounding against the dirt floor as I sprinted down the narrow corridor. The tunnel seemed to stretch and shift as I ran, the walls warping in the periphery of my vision, distorting in the dim light. I could hear the thumping growing louder, faster, a relentless beat that matched my frantic pace. My flashlight swung wildly, the beam bouncing off the walls, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with each movement. I stole a glance over my shoulder, but the tunnel behind me was a solid wall of darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. A presence, a force bearing down on me, filling the space with an oppressive weight that pressed against my back. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, a rotten, sour odor that clung to my skin and clothes, filling my nostrils with each desperate breath. I rounded a corner, nearly slipping on the loose dirt, as I stumbled into another narrow passageway. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I struggled to keep my bearings, the sense of direction slipping away as I focused solely on escaping the thing that chased me. My lungs burned, my legs aching as I pushed myself forward. The sound of my own labored breathing mixing with the relentless thump, thump, thump that echoed through the tunnel. The creature, or whatever it was closing in. I could hear its footsteps now, a heavy, lumbering sound that sent tremors through the ground, each step shaking the walls around me. It moved with an unnatural speed, faster than anything of its size had any right to move. The rhythmic thudding became deafening, a cacophony of sound that drowned out my thoughts, filling my mind with a single primal instinct: survive. I veered left at another fork in the tunnel, hoping to throw it off, but the sound didn't waver. It followed me, its heavy, relentless steps pounding in my ears, each one closer than the last. The tunnel began to narrow, the walls closing in around me, forcing me to duck and crouch as I moved, my flashlight barely illuminating the space ahead. The creature's breathing filled the tunnel now, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the walls, thick with a primal rage. I stumbled again, nearly falling as the tunnel dipped suddenly, the floor slanting downward into a narrow, uneven passage. I caught myself, forcing my legs to move, to keep running, even as the ground beneath me shifted and buckled with each step. My mind raced, frantically searching for a way out, a plan, anything that would give me a chance to escape. But the tunnel twisted and turned, a maze of dirt and stone that seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking me deeper into the earth, further from safety. The sound was deafening now, a thunderous roar that filled the tunnel, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. I could feel the creature's presence pressing in on me, an overwhelming force that filled the air, suffocating and relentless. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the batteries began to drain, casting brief, strobe-like flashes that illuminated the walls in bursts of pale light. Each flicker revealed the walls closing in tighter, the shadows stretching longer, the darkness growing deeper. I rounded another corner, and suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a wider chamber. I skidded to a halt, gasping for breath as I scanned the space, searching for any possible exit. But the chamber was empty, a dead end with walls that stretched up into darkness, sealing me in. The only way out was the tunnel I had just come from, the same tunnel where the creature's footsteps grew louder, closer, each beat a death knell echoing through the stone. My flashlight flickered one final time before the beam died, plunging me into darkness. I stood frozen, the silence broken only by the heavy, labored breaths of the creature that had pursued me, the sound filling the chamber, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the air. I pressed myself against the wall, feeling the cold, damp stone against my back as I tried to steady my breathing, to quiet the frantic pounding of my heart. But it was no use. The creature was here, in the darkness, its presence filling the space, an overwhelming force that pressed against me, crushing and inescapable. A single, piercing thought cut through the terror, clear and undeniable. This is the end. The creature's footsteps slowed, the thumping becoming a slow, deliberate beat, each step echoing through the chamber, growing louder, closer. I could feel it now, its presence looming in the darkness, a massive hulking shape that filled the space, blocking out all light, all hope. In the final moments as the creature closed in, I felt a strange calm wash over me, a quiet acceptance that settled in my bones. There was no escape, no chance of survival. The darkness pressed in, the silence thick and suffocating, and I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. But then, just as the creature's breath filled the air, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through my chest, I heard it, a faint, distant sound, like the soft whisper of wind through the trees. It was the sound of the city above, the faint hum of life, of hope, seeping through the cracks in the earth. And in that moment, with the creature's breath hot against my face, I made a choice. I pushed off from the wall, sprinting forward, plunging into the darkness with a final, desperate burst of energy. The creature roared, a deafening sound that filled the chamber, but I didn't look back. I ran, my footsteps pounding against the dirt floor, my lungs burning, my heart racing as I raced toward the sound of the world above, the faint, distant promise of light. The darkness closed in around me, the creature's footsteps echoing behind me, relentless and unyielding. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran through the winding tunnels, the twists and turns, a blur of shadows and stone, each step taking me closer to the surface, closer to safety, closer to life. And as I ran, the sound of the creature faded, swallowed by the distance, until there was only silence, a heavy, profound silence that filled the air, pressing down on me with the weight of a world unseen. And that silence followed me, even as I climbed out of the darkness, back into the light, back into the world above. A silence that would haunt me for the rest of my days. A silence that spoke of things best left unknown, secrets hidden in the depths, waiting in the dark. I raced through the darkness, the relentless thudding of the creature's footsteps echoing behind me, filling the narrow tunnel with a suffocating sense of impending doom. My breaths came in ragged gasps, the taste of fear thick on my tongue as I stumbled forward, desperate to outrun whatever was pursuing me. The creature was close, too close, and the uneven ground beneath my feet threatened to trip me with every step. In the pitch black, I felt myself lose my orientation, each turn blending into the last, and I could barely tell one passage from another. But I pressed on, every instinct screaming for me to keep moving, to not look back. My flashlight was gone, dropped somewhere in the chaos, and the only sense of direction I had left was the faint memory of the path I had taken to get here. I clung to that memory, forcing myself to retrace each step, each turn, while the creature's presence loomed closer, an unseen force driving me deeper into the labyrinth. Then, as I rounded a corner, my heart dropped. There it was, a solid wall of earth and stone blocking my path, a dead end. The narrow passage had funneled me here, trapping me with nowhere left to run. I pressed my hands against the rough wall, hoping, praying for some hidden crevice, some unnoticed crack that could lead to escape, but there was nothing. Just solid, impenetrable earth. My mind reeled, panic gripping me in a cold vice as I realized the inevitable truth. I was trapped, with no way out. I turned, back pressed against the wall, facing the darkness that filled the tunnel. The creature's footsteps had slowed, each one a heavy, deliberate beat that echoed through the earth, vibrating through the walls and filling the air with a primal menace. It was close now, just beyond the reach of the faint residual glow from my dead flashlight. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a massive, looming presence that filled the space, a shadow in the dark, waiting, watching. A strange calm washed over me, a sense of acceptance that settled in my bones, hollow and cold. I was out of options, out of time. There was no escape, no miracle waiting to save me. All I had left was the inevitability of what was coming, the finality of the end. With trembling hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my lighter and a cigarette, the familiar shape oddly comforting in the face of my fear. It felt surreal, lighting a cigarette here in the depths of the earth as something monstrous drew closer. But in that moment, it was all I had. A small, simple ritual that brought me a fleeting sense of control, a last act of defiance against the dark. The flame flickered to life, casting a small, fragile circle of light that illuminated the damp walls and the dirt floor around me. I lifted the cigarette to my lips, inhaling deeply, the taste of smoke harsh and bitter. It was a grounding sensation, a reminder of the world above, of the life I'd lived before I descended into this nightmare. The creature's steps halted just outside the reach of the light. I exhaled, watching the smoke curl through the air, spiraling up and disappearing into the darkness. I wondered, briefly, if it could see me, if it recognized the tiny flame as something foreign, something out of place in its realm. I took another drag, letting the ember burn brighter, casting a warm orange glow that pushed back the shadows ever so slightly. And that's when I saw it. Two glinting eyes reflecting the flame's light, watching me from the dark. They were huge, unnaturally bright, like animal eyes caught in headlights, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. The creature shifted, a low, rumbling growl vibrating through the air, a sound filled with a rage and hunger that felt almost sentient. I took another drag, inhaling the smoke, the ember burning dangerously close to my fingers. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its gaze locked on the flame, as if it were studying it, trying to understand it. And then, slowly, it began to retreat. Its footsteps receding, each one softer, more distant, until the tunnel was filled with silence once more. The silence was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. I stood there, heart pounding, the cigarette's ember my only light, and waited, unsure if it had truly gone or if it was waiting, hiding in the shadows, ready to strike the moment I let my guard down. But the seconds stretched into minutes, and the darkness remained empty. Realizing that I had a slim chance, I forced myself to move, to retrace my steps as carefully as I could. My legs shook as I turned, pressing one hand against the wall to guide myself through the blackness. The faint ember of my cigarette was barely enough to see by, but I clung to it, my only lifeline in the oppressive dark. Each step felt like a gamble, the silence around me thick with the threat of the creature's return. I focused on my breathing, keeping it slow and steady, fighting the urge to break into a run. Running would make too much noise, would draw it back to me. I had to stay quiet, to move carefully, to keep the darkness as my ally. The passage twisted and turned, each bend disorienting, but I forced myself to remember the path, to follow the faint impressions of my own footprints in the damp earth. The taste of smoke lingered in my mouth, the cigarette burning low, the ember flickering dangerously close to my fingertips. I took one last drag, feeling the warmth of the smoke fill my lungs, and then flicked the butt away, watching as it fell to the ground, the ember glowing faintly before fading into the dark. Now, I had only the sense of touch and sound to guide me, my hands trailing along the rough walls as I moved, ears straining for any hint of the creature's return. The silence was oppressive, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint, distant sounds of water dripping somewhere deep within the earth. Each drop echoed through the tunnel, a reminder of the isolation and of the vast emptiness of the space around me. I kept moving, each step taking me further from the dead end, closer to the faint memory of the path I had taken to get here. Time lost all meaning, the passage stretching endlessly before me, a dark corridor that seemed to wind on forever. But I didn't stop, didn't let myself think. I just focused on moving forward, one foot in front of the other, each step a small victory against the dark. At last, I felt a faint draft, a whisper of air brushing against my face, carrying with it the faintest hint of the outside world. The tunnel began to widen, the walls drawing back, the ceiling rising above me, and I felt the weight lifting, the claustrophobic press of the earth giving way to open space. The air grew cooler, fresher, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and soil. My steps quickened, a surge of hope rising within me as I moved toward the source of the air. The darkness began to lighten, a faint glow illuminating the passage ahead, and I realized, with a mix of relief and disbelief, that I was nearing the surface. I stumbled forward, my heart pounding with anticipation, and finally I saw it. The faint outline of the tunnel's entrance, a narrow slit of light that cut through the darkness, filling the space with a soft gray glow. I moved toward it, my breaths coming fast and shallow, each step bringing me closer to freedom, to safety. The last few yards were a blur, my body moving on instinct as I broke into a sprint, the light growing brighter, filling my vision, blinding after the hours I had spent in darkness. And then suddenly I was outside, stumbling out of the tunnel and into the open air, the world above a rush of sound and color that overwhelmed my senses. I collapsed to the ground, my hands digging into the wet earth, the cool rain falling around me, soaking my clothes, washing away the grime and sweat. I breathed in deeply, the fresh air filling my lungs, each breath a reminder that I had made it, that I was alive. For a long moment I lay there, staring up at the gray sky, feeling the rain on my face, the weight of the experience settling into my bones. The memories of the tunnel lingered, vivid and haunting, each detail etched into my mind. The oppressive darkness, the relentless thumping, the creature's eyes glinting in the light of my cigarette. It was over, but the fear, the terror of what I had faced, clung to me, a shadow that would follow me long after I left this place. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, casting one last glance at the tunnel entrance, the dark, gaping mouth that led down into the earth. The thought of descending into that darkness again filled me with a sense of dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. But I knew that eventually I would have to go back, to face the secrets hidden in the depths. But not today. Today, I would walk away, leave the darkness behind, let the rain wash away the memories, if only for a while. I turned, stepping away from the tunnel, the weight of the experience heavy on my shoulders, a reminder of the world that lay hidden beneath the city. A world of shadows and silence, of things unseen and unknown, waiting in the dark. And as I walked away, the sound of my footsteps echoed through the rain, a final, fading beat against the silence. A reminder that some places are best left unexplored, some mysteries best left unsolved, buried deep within the earth, far from the light of day. The rain continued to fall in gentle sheets, soaking me through as I walked away from the tunnel entrance, but the cold was nothing compared to the chill that still gripped my bones. The experience, that terrifying descent into darkness, had left an imprint on me, a lingering shadow that would follow me long after I returned to the routine of my life above ground. Even now, safe under the open sky, I could still feel the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down, the creature's relentless presence, that unnerving thump, 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 still echoing faintly in the recesses of my mind. I reached my truck, resting my hand on the cold metal of the door as I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs, steadying myself. But even as I did, the memories refused to leave. Every heartbeat seemed to carry a faint echo of that thundering pursuit, a reminder of just how close I'd come to being swallowed by the earth, by something ancient and unknown, something that should never have been disturbed. I climbed into the truck, fingers trembling slightly as I turned the key in the ignition, the sound of the engine momentarily breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around me. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy form lurking in the distance, watching, waiting. But there was nothing. Just the empty road, slick with rain, stretching out behind me. Yet in my mind, the tunnel remained, a black void etched into the landscape, a gateway to something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. I knew that what I'd experienced wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, and it was still down there, waiting in the dark. In the days that followed, I tried to go about my routine as usual, to push the experience from my mind, but the memories clung to me, haunting me in quiet moments, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I found myself avoiding certain areas of the storm drains, taking detours around places that reminded me of that night. The familiar tunnels, once a second home, now felt alien, each shadow holding a hint of menace, each echo a reminder of the creature that had chased me. The only thing that seemed to offer a semblance of control, a sense of security, was fire. I started bringing a small fire starter with me whenever I worked near the northeastern entrance, lighting a fire just outside the tunnel mouth, letting the flames flicker in the dark, casting a warm, protective glow. I wasn't sure if the creature would ever venture out again, if it was truly confined to the depths, but the fire felt like a ward, a barrier between its world and ours. I couldn't shake the belief that as long as the fire burned, it would stay away, that the light and heat would keep it at bay. At first, I told myself that this was just a precaution, a small act of reassurance, something to calm my nerves after such a traumatic encounter. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The creature had retreated from the light of my cigarette, had seemed almost afraid of the flame, and that small detail had rooted itself in my mind. I couldn't leave the entrance unguarded, couldn't risk allowing it to roam freely. If fire was the only thing it feared, then I would ensure the flames never died. Yet, even as I tended to that small fire each day, a moral dilemma gnawed at me. I couldn't ignore the responsibility I had, not only to protect myself, but also to safeguard the city. What I'd seen down there, what I'd experienced, was more than just a personal nightmare. It was a danger that lurked beneath the surface, a threat that, if left unchecked, could one day wreak havoc on the unsuspecting world above. But how could I explain it to anyone else? The creature, the hidden tunnel, the echoes in the darkness, it sounded like the ravings of a madman, the kind of story that would be dismissed as superstition, or worse, laughed off as an elaborate fabrication. And even if someone did believe me, the thought of involving the city council, of subjecting the tunnel to the cold scrutiny of bureaucracy, filled me with dread. They would send teams down there, bring heavy machinery, dig deeper, disrupt the fragile balance that kept the creature confined. And if they disturbed it, if they angered it, who knew what would happen? The thought of officials, engineers, and construction workers trampling into that ancient, hidden world felt like an intrusion, a violation. I'd seen firsthand the creature's reaction to being disturbed, had felt its rage, its raw, primal power, and I knew that it wasn't something that could be contained or controlled. It was a force of nature, a part of the earth itself, and the idea of unleashing it upon the city was unthinkable. So I kept the truth to myself, choosing to shoulder the burden alone. Each day, I tended to the fire, letting its flames flicker near the tunnel entrance, a silent promise to the creature, a wordless pact that as long as I guarded this threshold, it would remain below. I felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on me, a heavy, unspoken vow that bound me to the darkness, to the creature lurking within. But that decision, that choice to bear the truth alone, began to change me. The experience had altered my perspective on my work, on the hidden networks that stretched beneath the city. The storm drains, once a series of concrete passages and maintenance corridors, now felt like a gateway, a fragile boundary separating our world from something far older, something unknowable. Every tunnel, every shadowed corner held a new sense of mystery, a hint of the unknown, and I couldn't walk those paths without wondering what else lay hidden in the depths. I found myself moving more cautiously, my senses heightened, every sound and movement in the drains filling me with a sense of unease. The tunnels had lost their familiarity, their comforting regularity. Now, they felt like a labyrinth, a maze that twisted and turned, leading not just through the city's infrastructure, but down, deeper into the earth, towards secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. I couldn't help but feel that the creature I'd encountered was just one of many, a single sentinel guarding a vast, forgotten world that stretched beneath our feet. The other StormDrain workers noticed the change in me, though they never pressed for details. They saw the fire burning each day near the northeastern entrance, a ritual they couldn't understand. And while some of them asked, curious or concerned, I always brushed it off with a vague answer. They could sense something had happened, something I wasn't sharing, but in our line of work, personal experiences were often kept private and no one pushed for answers. Still, I could see the unease in their eyes, the way they watched me with a mix of sympathy and suspicion, as if they, too, could sense the shift, the presence of something waiting below. A few of them even started joining me near the fire, lighting their own small flames, a silent solidarity, a collective acknowledgement of the unseen forces that governed our world below ground. We never spoke of it, never acknowledged the ritual for what it was, but there was a sense of understanding, a shared fear that needed no words. As the weeks passed, the memories of that night became a part of me, woven into the fabric of my thoughts, a constant, unyielding reminder of the darkness that lay beneath. I could still feel it in quiet moments, a faint echo of that relentless thumping, that cold, unblinking gaze watching from the shadows. The creature was still down there, waiting, and while I held no illusions about controlling it, I held on to the hope that the fire, that small, flickering light, was enough to keep it at bay. In the end, the experience had taught me a harsh, unyielding truth, that some mysteries are best left unsolved, some secrets best left buried. The city above moved on, blissfully unaware of the ancient forces that lay hidden beneath, of the shadows that stretched deep into the earth, holding truths that defied understanding. And I, too, would move on, my life continuing in the quiet shadows of the storm drains, my days spent in silent vigilance, guarding a threshold that few would ever know existed. But every time I descended into the tunnels, every time I walked those darkened paths, I would feel it. The faint, lingering presence of the creature, the echo of its steps in the silence, a reminder that the earth held its own mysteries, its own terrors waiting in the dark. And as long as I lived, as long as the fire burned, I would guard those secrets, keep them safe. For I knew that some things were never meant to be seen, that some boundaries should never be crossed. In the quiet moments when the world above was asleep and the fire crackled softly in the night, I would sit by the tunnel entrance, staring into the flames, feeling the weight of the earth pressing down, a silent reminder of the darkness that lay below, a darkness that would remain, waiting, watching, as long as the fire held. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that I would carry that secret to my grave, a guardian of the shadows, a keeper of the fire, bound forever to the mysteries that lay in wait beneath the city's sleeping streets. In the end, I accepted that the tunnels and the creature lurking within were beyond my understanding, beyond human comprehension. They belonged to the earth, to a world that existed long before us, a world that would remain long after we were gone. I became a silent protector, a keeper of secrets, watching over the boundary between light and dark, holding the line against forces that few could even imagine. And as I sat by the fire, watching its flames dance in the night, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of my role. I had seen the darkness, had felt its weight, and I knew that it was a part of the world as real and as powerful as the city above. I would guard it, hold it, and keep it safe for as long as I could. For I knew, in the deepest parts of my soul, that some secrets were best kept in the dark, some mysteries best left unsolved, hidden in the shadows, waiting, watching, in the depths of the earth, far from the light of day. After my encounter, the world of urban legends and real-life underground discoveries took on a new significance. Stories of hidden catacombs, forgotten tunnels, and strange subterranean happenings felt like they were calling to me, whispering echoes of the creature I had faced in the depths. These stories, often passed down as folklore or strange local anecdotes, held a power I hadn't previously considered, a power that hinted at truths buried beneath cities, hidden in shadows, waiting to be uncovered. As I dug into these tales, they only deepened my understanding of what I had experienced, and I began to see that my encounter was not as singular as I had thought. Other people too had faced the unknown beneath the earth, leaving behind stories that mixed fact and fear, courage and horror.